Welcome to the ADF Architecture TV channel. My name is Chris Muir. I'm an ADF product manager working for Oracle Corporation. In today's episode and the next episode, we're going to be looking at topics that aren't so relevant to architects, but more to senior ADF developers, team leaders, and really all developers out there. And that is, we're going to be talking about ADF code and naming guidelines and ADF project layout guidelines. Basically, how do you keep your applications, their layout, their names, all consistent to ease maintainability, readability, and so on and so forth. Now, the need for such guidelines, that is code and naming guidelines and project layout guidelines, should be relatively clear to most senior developers. You know that with such guidelines that over the long term of an ADF project, including when it goes into the maintenance phase, it does assist to have consistent code, naming, object conventions and project layout conventions across your whole application, because it assists the readability of your application. Generally, people don't have to try and digest each variable name or each object name or try and work out where things are on this particular ADF project. Everything is in basically a standard location. It also therefore assists the maintainability of your application, that your support crew, your ADF maintenance team can go from one ADF application to another, and ignoring that the systems might actually implement different business functionality, they'll know that, hey, these sort of objects typically will be in this location, these sort of objects will typically have these sort of names, and it will just basically speed the whole maintenance process up. Another important thing from the ADF perspective, and not just from the maintenance of an ADF application, but even during the normal build and deployment phases, is also that of naming collisions. With ADF objects and particularly bounded task flows, it's very important that they have a unique namespace or a unique ID. So you need to propose conventions or guidelines in naming those task flows to ensure that you don't hit those collisions and then have to ask programmers to refactor their code. And from my perspective as an ex-team leader, as an ex-developer, in terms of code guidelines and project layout guidelines, I think the adoption of these and the enforcement of these just shows a very well-oiled development team. Organisations that don't have these in place, basically, well, they're freewheeling it. They're not really got their act together. So if you want to show a level of professionalism in your development teams, you need to have these sort of guidelines. Now, with that in mind, the guidelines that I'm proposing here, the guidelines, and you'll see there's numerous of them, is that these guidelines come from Oracle Corporation, but they're just guidelines. In terms of guidelines and naming conventions and project layout conventions, there is a number of different ways to skin a cat. So my purpose, or our purpose, in providing these to you is really just to accelerate your development and stop you having to write the guidelines yourself. But if you've already got your own guidelines and your own conventions, good for you, you're ahead of the game. You're an expert development team. Well done, stick with your guidelines. But hey, look at our guidelines just to work out, why do they have a guideline for that? We don't have a guideline for that, maybe we should have a guideline for that. You know, our guidelines should still be useful to teams that actually have their own guidelines in place. So keep these guidelines in mind, but if you are a new development team starting out with our guidelines, realize that our guidelines aren't law. They're not black letter law. If you break them, that in many cases we'll come after you with a big Oracle red texter and say you've done a bad thing. In many cases with code naming guidelines in particular, if you decide to have plurals or singular in object names, it really doesn't make that much difference, does it? Just as long as you document what your rule is or your guideline is and you follow that specific rule. Okay, so be consistent. Be consistent, be consistent, be consistent with these guidelines, and this is all about assisting the readability and maintainability of your overall applications. And let's be honest here, even Oracle itself, you will have seen code from Oracle at times that is not consistent. We even break our own guidelines. But again, conventions and guidelines are all here designed to assist you in basically, making your applications readable, maintainable, improving the productivity of your development teams, and avoiding some of those namespace collision issues that we're going to articulate more in these overall episodes. Alright, so what I'd like to do from here is introduce all of our 233 guidelines. So guideline number 1 of 233, let's forget that. I'm not going to actually take you through 233 guidelines today. So rather than discuss all 233 points, what I'd instead like to do is direct you to the ADF Architecture Square website, and you can see the bit.ly link on this particular slide. Now on that OTN website, the ADF Architecture Square, you'll find two documents, the ADF Naming Guidelines and the ADF Project Layout Guidelines. And those two documents really encompass all the different guidelines and conventions we'd like to put forward so you can use. Now those documents have been especially designed to be referenceable. You'll notice that each guideline has a little error code or a little 4-letter acronym and then a number associated with them. So something like ADF NG 12345, and the reason we've done that is such that when you actually look at your own applications and you find, okay, that actually violates Oracle's guidelines there, instead of just trying to articulate the guideline, you can just refer to the actual code, and this will make it easier for people to look it up. So what I'd like to do in the rest of this episode then is just talk about some of the salient points from those particular guides. And in addition, address, well, remember in the ADF architectural patterns presentations or episodes that we looked at earlier on, I want to take a real pattern or a real application layout and apply them to the guidelines. So that's what we're going to talk about in the episode from here. So you might remember from the ADF Architecture pattern episodes of the ADF Architecture TV channel is we had this particular architectural pattern called the sum of the parts architecture. So let's talk through some naming conventions and some workspace and project layout conventions as applied to this overall architectural pattern. Now let's just simplify this pattern so we can actually talk about these actual guidelines. So here we can see in this particular pattern we have a common workspace, two BTF workspaces and a master workspace. Let's simplify that down and in the end we're going to just look at the workspaces. Let's talk about the workspaces first, then the projects, then the package structures. And specifically, let's consider that we're building an application that's based on the good old Oracle HR demo schema. So for this particular application, while there still will be a common workspace, in addition to the BTF workspaces, there will be one that actually deals with employees, so we can see that on the left, and departments, which we can see in the middle. And finally, those two bounded task load workspaces, they'll be consumed by the overall application called the HR workspace, and that's our master workspace. Okay, so let's talk about some of the challenges that our developers are going to hit with this sort of layout. Now, obviously, first of all, we have for workspaces, and we might have many more as we add more bounded task load workspaces at some stage. In addition, we know that the workspaces contain multiple projects and they will require their own package structures. So this is where you're going to have to make sure that there isn't actually naming collisions across the different packages in the different workspaces. Beyond that, in terms of bounded task flows, in addition across your different workspaces, you need to ensure that when they're consumed into the master workspace, the HR workspace in this case, that they have a unique ID or namespace as well. And we know we're going to generate numerous ADF libraries, okay? So it's going to be numerous ADF libraries that might be hard to track to work out where they came from. So we need to have an understanding of our naming conventions there to make things simpler. So in the end, we must not have naming collisions, okay? The framework will actually say you can't, so you need to come up with conventions that will solve that. In addition, we want the goal of programmers shouldn't be confused where our code is coming from. So for example, if we look at an ADF library, it should be damn obvious that, hey, it comes from a specific workspace project. And as we've got in the future potential for our application to expand and grow and even more applications in the future, we need to have naming conventions and project layout conventions that can take that into account. We need some wiggle room. We don't want to railroad ourselves now into defining conventions that, when we bring our next application on, we go, now we need to go back and refactor all our previous application because we've got naming collisions. So the best place to start in explaining this is from the Fusion Web Application Wizard. Okay, so we're going to use that for understanding how to set up our workspaces and address a lot of the challenges that we just talked about. Now I'm going to be bringing up this wizard numerous times for different workspaces. Remember, we're going to be creating multiple workspaces, so I just need to simplify this screen down a little bit rather than having all the details there in front of us, okay? So with that in mind, one of the first things I want to point out in terms of the actual workspaces that you create is that it's well worth with your developers defining a standard location on their PCs where they're checking code out to. Now this is really kind of peripheral to, I guess, all the conventions that we're talking about, but do remember that when you've got multiple developers working on the same piece of code, if that developer suddenly leaves, gets run over by a bus, but they've got, hey, all that code checked out that they've been writing all the latest features in, you will have to go and discover that code in their machine, and that might be a difficult exercise if you haven't standardized where they should be checking things out. In addition, build scripts. Okay, build scripts will assume that code exists at a certain location. Otherwise, you've got to configure in the build scripts a lot of flexibility. So again, standardizing this will help. And hey, even virus scanners. We've talked about in previous episodes that things like McAfee will come along and scan every bit of Java code. So if you want to put an exemption into McAfee such that your developer's PC productivity is sped up, well, you still need to define a standard location where they're checking everything out too. Now the next thing to note is you also need, in terms of all your application workspaces, to include an application package prefix. Now typically the Java convention for this is the reverse URL notation for your organization's domain name. So if your company is called Acme and you have a website called acme.com, a company making everything.com, then the notation you would use here is com.acme. Now from Oracle's perspective, because there is no other Oracle corporation out there, we don't actually have to put the .com there. We don't go com.oracle, we just go Oracle. But in your case, it's a very good convention to include these company or reverse domain names in your overall Java and ADF code. Now the next thing we want to do is we need to ensure that we have workspace names that are unique amongst all workspaces. So your workspace is a primary artifact from an architectural point of view and will be shared across numerous applications, numerous BTF workspaces, and so on and so forth. So a very strong guideline here is to make sure that those workspace names are unique, because that will assist you in identifying one from another. Having the same workspace name really does get quite difficult later on to say, is that bit of code from that workspace X or that workspace X? So you get the kind of idea here. So referring to our architectural patterns, where we had 4 workspaces, as you can see here, I have a common workspace, a EMP flows workspace, a depth flows workspace, and a HR workspace. And notice how the names basically differentiate each from the rest of them. Just to take this one step further here, also make sure your workspace have meaningful names, okay? I've been at so many sites, and this isn't just particular to ADF, but where, you know, their code artifacts just have meaningless code names, and every contractor and next developer that comes in has to spend 3 months just trying to work out what these meaningless names mean. They're usually based on some sort of legacy artifact. You're adopting ADF, it's a new technology, take the opportunity to get meaningful names into your workspace names. Now a little caveat to that though is that unfortunately those workspace names, you really do want to also have those in your package names. Now the package name constructs, if you start including long names like vehicle licensing system, your package names just get ridiculously large. So to contradict myself, do pick meaningful names, long articulate names, but then also names that can be abbreviated, and that abbreviation is commonly known, so we can put those in the packages. Now, again, returning to our sum of the parts architecture pattern, obviously if we're going to have a workspace that has common artifacts in it or generic artifacts in it, it really does help to have the name common in there, okay, in the actual workspace name. And that kind of extends to the project names in that application as well. Everybody very much understands that concept of common or shared or generic or general. So, you know, with the workspace names, try to indicate what their purpose is for. If we extend that to the bounded task flow workspaces, again, it makes sense in their application workspace name to have something to say that, hey, this is a collection of flows. So maybe EMP flows or depth flows is a good name. Or if you don't want to go with flows because maybe you'll have more generic code in there besides just bounded task flows, call it EMP modules or depth modules or something along those lines. Something to indicate the type of workspace. However, finally, with the main application, such as the main application that we're going to be publishing here is the Human Resources application, just have a simple name for that, such as HR in this example, or procurement, or payroll. Don't go too complex in the names here, and don't try to differentiate them from all the other workspaces, because it'll be pretty damn obvious these are the main applications. We don't really need a categorization in this regards. Now, another recommendation, and this is really a personal one, and not all developers and all Oracle staff out here agree with me, but I very much like using for our different workspaces, when we check them out, depending on the category of workspace, so say our common versus our banner taskbar workspaces versus our applications, I very much like to use a subdirectory to place those in, to categorize them, such that it becomes, again, damn obvious what they're actually used for. We really want developers, when they're looking at these artifacts, to go, the name EmpFlows, oh, that must be about a taskbar workspace. The name is very meaningful to them. And, it's in the Flows subdirectory of the development directory. Oh, that really does mean it's about a taskbar workspace. It's not in the applications directory. See how the names of the application workspaces and the subdirectory structures here can really help enforce the meaning to the developer so they can quickly pick up what's going on in terms of overall architecture. To extend that, you can see in the package prefix here for each application workspace, we have a subcategory name such as .common or .flows or .apps. And then we actually have after that the specific actual name of the overall workspace in terms of the package prefix. Again, very quickly, by looking at a package, the developer can quickly understand, this set of code, this is common code. It's not something that we're meant to put custom code in. No, this is the apps. No, this is the thing that's going to actually be running. This is a different package from all the others. A final little point here, and it's just again one of readability and maintainability. When you define your applications and you then go and put those in a particular directory, make sure that the application name, the directory name, and the resulting .jws file, so that's the Java Workspace file, the XML file that JDeveloper keeps in the background for keeping all the configurations of your overall workspace, make sure that these match. Don't have different cases and different names. Why? Because again, it just becomes a bit of a headache later on when you're developing, say, build scripts. Did you mean the workspace with a capital E and a lowercase emp and a lowercase flows, or did you mean the workspace with a lowercase e and everything in lowercase? Just keep it all consistent. It will make the overall development of supporting code and the discussions between your developers and what's checked into Subversion and so on and so forth just a lot easier to understand. Remember again, our guidelines are here designed to address the readability and the maintainability of our overall application. Now, if we put workspaces aside and instead consider the projects within a workspace, some of the same conventions do apply. Firstly, the project name, the project directory, and the .jpr file, keep the names and the case all the same. Keep it consistent. Another guideline I'll make, and not all Oracle staff agree with this particular guideline, but when you're naming your projects, use the conventions or the naming conventions that JDeveloper typically uses. So a model project is called model and a view controller project is called view controller. Now, if you've looked at the demo applications created by product management and other Oracle staff in the past, you know we break that convention. Okay, we have all sorts of different names for our different projects. But if I'm imagining I'm a project team leader, a technical team leader, and I'm hiring in new staff to work on my ADF applications, what project names are they going to be more familiar with? Those that JDeveloper proposes, or those that some team has just made up themselves? Now, I'm in no way criticizing my fellow colleagues, but you kind of got to remember that it's all about, with naming conventions and project layout conventions, it's about reducing the learning curve of those new developers coming on board. So while you can go and change the name of absolutely everything and the layouts, do you really want to? Maybe you want to keep with more of the generic conventions that all ADF developers will be familiar with. Now, the next thing I'd want to consider in terms of projects is that the project package names are unique across all workspaces. Now, why is that important? because with this sum of the parts architecture, where you're taking multiple workspaces and multiple code artifacts from all sorts of different workspaces and bringing them into a main application, a unique package for each project will allow you to differentiate between the code artifacts of one workspace project against another's. So this would allow you not to hit any naming collisions if you follow this convention. Now again, what sort of package structure do you come up with? Well, one we can easily propose for you is, again, you use the organization name or a reverse domain name, then .workspace type. So remember, we had the concept of common or flows or modules or apps, the workspace name itself, and then the project name. Okay, and there are some examples here that you can see on the slide. So that, in the ADF Architecture TV episode, is a real brief introduction to some naming conventions and project layout conventions. Now, the documents that we referred to you on the ADF Architecture Square have, as I said, plenty more guidelines for you to adopt there. But a general explanation, starting out for people to understand where those guidelines are coming from, is always going to be useful. In the next episode of the ADF Architecture TV channel, we're going to drill into the naming and project layout guidelines just a little bit more, but specifically consider ADF business component package structures and also structures within your view controller project for your unbounded and your bounded task flows. Basically, where do you put all the files for the UTFs and BTFs, which include the XML files, any beans, any pages, any fragments, and so on and so forth. So again, just trying to organize the overall structure of your applications. So thanks again for joining us on the ADF Architecture TV channel today. Hopefully it's been useful, and we look forward once again to seeing you in the next episode, to be published very soon.